Welcome to this inaugural quick guide to painting and other parts of the hobby from the last battalion. In this quick guide, we'll be looking at painting flesh tones, specifically faces and hands. For the purposes of this guide, you'll see some of the tools, paints and the miniatures we'll be using in front of you. The first thing I recommend is a very fine detail paintbrush like this one I have here. This one I think is from the Army Painter range, but in common with any of the things that I'll show you throughout the guide, you should use whatever suits you the most and whatever paints you're comfortable with using. There isn't a right or wrong way to go about this technique. It's simply a guideline for you to follow that hopefully will enhance your own hobby. These are some of the miniatures we'll be using: a Perry plastic Prussian musketeer and a couple of Perry Prussian French infantry, here with the colours blocked in to represent Italians as that part of my collection. These are some of the paints I'll be using, including a Citadel wash here, a Carroburg Crimson, and a Vallejo game colour. In this case it's charred brown, but you can use any dark brown shade, basically as a foundational colour to go over the primer. As you can see here, a black primer has been applied to the Prussian musketeer, and this will act as a good basis for your flesh tones, which are these. In my case I'm using scale 75, basic, golden and pale skin tones, but you should use whatever is in your collection that represents a nice triad that will mix together and complement each other. So let's go ahead and do the first stage, which is to apply the dark brown colour of your choice to the flesh parts of the miniature, ready to apply the skin tones afterwards. It's also a good opportunity to cover things like the hair, backpack and other parts of the miniature that a dark brown will be useful for. Having completed that, here you can see the Prussian musketeer. The next stage is to take what we'll use as our foundation basic layer of flesh that we're going to work from. In this case, I'm using scale 75's basic flesh. This is quite a muted, neutral skin tone to be using, and as such will act as a good building block for working up through the steadily lighter skin tones. Of course, remember that it depends what ultimate finished skin tone you're trying to achieve. I'm going for a generic, non-specific Western European tone that will look good from a distance. So we'll go ahead and apply that to the hands, face, and also the ears. Don't forget those on the miniature. Now here you can see that the Prussian musketeer has caught up with the Italians, who'd already had the majority of their colours blocked in. The next stage for these is optional. I like to put a slight wash on the miniatures, in this case a Seraphim Sepia, just to help me define where the details are as I continue to work on the miniature, and then touch that up by reapplying the original basic tone where perhaps it's got a little bit messy, and it'll also act then as a good basis for the next step. If you want to skip ahead and go to the next stage of applying colour, then go to 4 minutes 22. As you can see here, if you are doing this optional additional step, which I like to do, then it's just a loose application of whichever wash you wish, and just let that dry in the different tones. Then once we've done that, we'll have to reapply some of the basic flesh tone just to tidy the miniature up, and also it gives you that opportunity to apply the famous second thin coat, and then you've got a really good base to work from as you then highlight up through the different flesh tones that you've chosen. Even at this stage, now that you can see I've moved on to using a fine detail brush instead of the rough brush that I used for the initial layer and for the wash, I absolutely counsel patience, because it will absolutely be worth it at the end of the process. And I tend to find that finishing off details like the flesh that give real character to the miniature are worth applying just a little bit of extra time to. Now you can see here that the Prussian musketeer is in the stage of having the next tone applied, which is the golden skin tone from scale 75, or whichever you want to use as the main basis, the mid colour for the flesh tones that you're going to paint. Take your time with these stages, and as you now start to move up from the original basic colour that we applied to the flesh, just remember to leave a progressive highlight between each one, so leaving the previous shade in the recesses of the miniature and painting slightly less of it, and that will build up a nice effect as we work through each of the different colours. As you can see here, I'm just carefully picking out some of the areas around the nose and eyes and leaving a little bit of shadow. I'm not painting the eyes into these miniatures. It would be extremely time consuming to do very accurately, and I don't think they necessarily need it. But it's up to you. You could do that at any point during this process. Once you've finished applying whichever the main colour is going to be for your flesh tones, you'll remember at the beginning I introduced the Carroburg Crimson colour, and you don't have to use a specific wash. But what I like to do at this stage is selectively apply it into certain details of the miniatures, so between the fingers, where the hands emerge from the cuffs, and in some of the linings and folds of the face around the nose and eyes and ears, and also the hairline, because that just gives a nice sort of rich reddish hue as you paint the rest of the miniature that set off the tones that will come after it. If you wanted to, for example, imply that a miniature was cold or ill, you could use other tones as well, because it will show through in the shading of the miniature. So, for example, cold could be represented by a blue. But in this case, you can see I'm just going to go ahead and put this red ink wash into those little crevices and details that I talked about. Now, unlike when I applied the sepia wash earlier, and as you will have done if you've chosen to use that step, I'm being much more precise in how I apply this, because yes, you'll have to do a certain amount of a reapplication of your main tone, the golden skin that I've used in this case, but you want to try and keep that down to a minimum so that you're not creating yourself additional work. And here we are. So having allowed that red ink to dry, this is the golden skin tone again. We're going to go ahead and just apply that to any areas where perhaps we've overlapped onto broader parts of the hands or face that we didn't mean to. And also identifying any areas where the coverage was perhaps a bit thin the first time we applied it. Now this is a good opportunity as well to use the ink as a formal basis for a layer of highlight. So you don't have to really fully touch up all the areas where the ink has run to or bled to, and it'll act as a nice shade before we apply the actual highlight layers in a moment. So you can see I'm just going around here and picking out the different bits of the face, perhaps leaving some of the ink perhaps where it's thin in the recesses of the cheek to give a little bit of shading and a little bit of effect. And here we are. So this is the Prussian Musketeer, having had the golden skin tone, the main mid-tone that we're using, carefully reapplied, perhaps leaving some of the red ink in some selective areas. And you can see already that this looks pretty good. I mean, I'd be happy with this as a tabletop standard miniature, because the steps we've already taken have created a succession of natural highlights on some of these areas. We're now going to move on to applying more specific highlights to different parts of the face and the hands using progressively lighter paints. For anybody not familiar with the process, it's literally just that, is applying slightly lighter shades in sequence, but at each stage applying it to slightly less of the model, like contours, moving up the elevation of the details. This will give a nice sense of depth to all those nicely sculpted details on the model. The number of highlights you apply are really up to you and the effect that you're trying to achieve. So let's move on. For the next step, we're going to take the golden flesh tone, or the mid-tone that you've used, and mix it, in my case, with this pale skin tone from scale 75, or whichever next colour up that you'd wish to use. In this case, the pale skin is quite a jump from the golden skin, so I'm going to do the next stage by mixing them 50-50, rather than progressing on to the next one, because it would probably look too harsh by itself. However, depending on the paints that you've chosen, you may have chosen a much more natural and steady progression, and you could just move on to the next one. So this is the first of the two more traditional highlights that I'm going to do using gradually lighter shades. So in this case, as I said, this is the 50-50 mix of the golden skin, the main tone, and the pale skin that I'm using. And as I said, if you want to make this process more straightforward for yourself, then I highly recommend selecting a triad or however many levels of highlights you wish to use that are perhaps slightly closer together and more complementary. But if you want to blend the shades together, even with those, you could do a 50-50 layer. It just depends how much extra work you want to make for yourself. So here you can see, having applied it to the Prussian Musketeer, I'm now working it around all the different bits and pieces of the Italian Fusiliers and applying it just to those areas that I want to pick out. And here we have the miniature after that stage has been completed. As you can see, it's looking pretty good. So the next thing is we're going to move on to the final and top highlight, at least in the series I'm doing. You could go on even further. And we're going to apply this pale skin colour as it is, just to the most raised parts of the miniature to pick them out and really make those sort of flesh tones pop and create that sense of depth. Although each of the stages requires a certain amount of patience, as you go up through each level of highlight, depending on how many you're using, and certainly in this case, you're going to need to be even more patient and precise, just to make sure that you don't accidentally apply paint to any areas that you don't mean to and undo any of the work that you've done before this. And we're just being really selective about all those highest elements, those raised details in the miniature they want to pick out to just complete the overall effect of the flesh tones. In the case of the paints that I've chosen to use for this particular guide, I don't think that necessarily I would actually highlight any larger area of the miniature using this particular pale skin colour, or indeed use an even lighter colour to do any more highlights, as to do so would make the miniatures perhaps look bizarrely pale or artificially pale. But I only know this because I've sort of practiced and fallen into a groove of exactly the kind of look that I'm going for. But depending on how you mix and apply the different shades you have, you could get darker skin tones or lighter skin tones. And there we have it. That's all the steps required, or at least all the steps that I've chosen to include in this guide. As I've said throughout, you can include or remove as many of these stages as find convenient to you, and whichever mixture of paints, colours, inks, whatever you want to use to achieve your desired effect, but the steps that I've used will be largely the same throughout. As you can see on both the Prussian Musketeer and the Italian Fusiliers, what will really help define them is when those final details around the face are also completed, including their hair and facial hair. As you can see on the side of this Italian Fusilier, he's actually got quite a large area of sideburn that needs tidying up. They'll just help complete that overall effect. I hope this guide has been useful for you, and I hope to see you in the next one. In the meantime, happy hobbying.